Hello, and welcome to Mending with Gold, the Kintsugi Therapist Collective podcast. Kintsugi Therapist Collective, or KTC, is a virtual community for therapists and aligned care workers dedicated to building embodied and liberatory practices of care. Each guest is invited to explore three aspects of Kintsugi as a metaphor for mending a place of brokenness in their life. Kintsugi is the Japanese art of repairing pottery with lacquer and precious metals. By emphasizing rather than hiding what is broken, the whole experience of the object is honored. Infused with the ethos of KTC, Mending with Gold is a space to connect and explore the reality that there is strength, beauty, and value in the brokenness that is intrinsic to being human. For the care workers tuning in, we are currently enrolling several offerings beginning in the new year. We will be running a second iteration of Barriers to Nourishment for any mental health care worker wanting to ground in a rich understanding of how our complex relationship to food, sex, exercise, rest, desire, and joy show up in our practice and in ourselves. A new offering, Mixed Identity Clinical Alliance, a bi-weekly process group and consultation space that centers the layers, multitudes, and specificities of mixed-race therapists in clinical practice, begins in February. And last but certainly not least, our 7th Embodied Private Practice Cohort starts in April. More information and links to the applications are available on the Offerings tab of our website. Today we welcome Dr. Han Ren to Mending with Gold. Dr. Han Ren is a licensed clinical and school psychologist, consultant, speaker, and educator. She is deeply rooted in liberation and anti-oppressive work, practicing from a justice-oriented, interpersonal, culturally humble, and systems-informed framework. Through their widely viewed content on social media, they strive to make mental health accessible and applicable to our daily lives. Dr. Ren addresses the pursuit of collective healing through her work centered in historically overlooked communities, especially Asian Americans and children of immigrants. She has been featured on the TEDx stage, the Headspace app, BuzzFeed, and the Huffington Post. When she's not in the therapy chair, you can find her laughing with family and friends, caffeinating with black coffee, dancing off beat to live music, and pelotoning.
Okay, well, Han, welcome to the Mending with Gold podcast. We are really glad to have you here. And before we start, I just want to note that we are recording this the day before the election in the United States. And we were just talking about how there are many, many emotions going on with ourselves and with the clients that we work with. And we're holding a lot of space for anxiety and terror and I don't know what else, all sorts of things. So that is kind of in the mix as we're talking today. So we're really happy to have you here. And we'd like to start with the first question we ask everyone, which is maybe if you could talk about a wound or a kind of difficult moment or theme in your life that you want to share with us, and kind of a little bit about how it came about or how you understand it coming about.
Ooh, thank you so much for having me, and for acknowledging, all the things that we're holding together collectively and also personally, individually. This is such a great question, and I'm gonna kind of answer it thematically. I think for me, I have a pretty significant complex trauma background from early childhood, and that's also what makes me really good at working with other complex trauma survivors. And I have been able to alchemize that pain for the most part. But there is still this theme where my nervous system struggles with being okay and being calm and being content and happy. And there are just seasons and patterns in my life where I feel like I need more stimulation than the average person. And if I'm not tracking it, I will stir things up for myself and my loved ones in ways that can be really disruptive. And it's something that I have noticed throughout my life, and I have really tried to alchemize it and keep a lid on it. And most of the time it's okay, but sometimes a lot of things pile up and it gets a little out of hand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How do you see that connected, just for folks who kind of aren't as familiar with complex PTSD and all the manifestations and defenses and ways of coping? How do you kind of tie that back to some of your traumatic experiences or complex PTSD?
Yeah. So, just developmentally as children, we kind of get used to a template for how the world should be. And so if we are entering the world and we're growing up in our early childhood, formative years in a lot of chaos, then our nervous systems get really used to a lot of chaos. And we think this is how life should be. This is what's normal. And so the prospect of things being calm or good or peaceful or content is actually really activating and scary for a lot of us survivors. And so then we find different ways, either consciously or subconsciously, to activate the nervous system to be more familiar because it's what we know and it's what we think on a body level that life should be like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in your adult life,
Mm.
is there kind of like an example you could give us of how this sort of shows up for you or has shown up recently? I think a lot of times, we as adults, so often what I hear from my clients is, I should be past this. Like, I understand
Mhm.
it. I understand the pattern and I understand the behavior, and it just keeps popping up, and um I'm sure you deal with that with your clients too and have your own clinical approach to kind of talking to folks about that.
Right.
But yeah, do you have any ways of describing that, how that shows up in your adult life and sort of how you've kind of taken an attitude of hopefully some gentleness towards that, but maybe not always,
Yeah.
as we do.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because there is a lot of like self-flagellation and judgment, right? Like, especially as a clinician who specializes in this, like, I should be over this. I should not have to do this in this way. So an example is, so this summer, so I'm writing a book, and writing a book is definitely the hardest thing I've ever tried to do professionally, especially one that's like self-help memoir based because it requires such excavation and
Mhm.
such you know, you have to hold your own past selves, all the iterations of yourselves in such like honest, raw, yet gentle ways so you can transform that into words that can not only describe your own experiences, but be helpful for others who might be going through something similar.
Mhm.
So I took some time off from clinical work this summer to really deep dive into writing and like being with myself. And it was pretty brutal, and I kind of like dug myself into this deep, deep trench of like introspection that made me feel pretty depressed and nihilistic. So the antidote to that is to overschedule, right? So I spent June and July like really clearing my schedule, doing a lot of writing and feeling like I was languishing and wallowing. And I did do a lot of writing, so that was great. But I also felt really depressed. So then I spent
Mhm.
August and September like spinning out into space in the other way of just, over scheduling myself, a lot of going out with friends, new people, trying to embrace the world in a way that I didn't allow myself to earlier in the summer. And to a point of near exhaustion where I was, letting priorities fall and not being a good partner or mother, or, just really pushing through my own boundaries. And then I've spent the past month trying to like rein all of that back in and find this equilibrium, and, find that balance between inner work and outer distraction.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah. Well, I guess the whole notion of equilibrium, in a way, is part of what gets dysregulated for folks who experience complex PTSD, right? I mean, like, what is my equilibrium? Like, what is quote unquote balance? It feels like it's really hard to access that or understand what that actually is. Because it feels, like you said, it kind of feels wrong in your body to have things be calm. Like,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah. So
Yeah.
do you have anything like you could share about your version of equilibrium, like what you've kind of landed
Mhm.
on right now in your life?
Yeah. I mean, I think, balance is a pendulum for everyone. And for complex trauma survivors, like it is so much more, like the swings are going to be higher. And I think that's something that I have come to accept within my process. It's like for some people, they can just swing and then like find somewhere in the middle. I'm gonna have to hit the ceiling on both sides sometimes,
Yeah.
and that's okay. And that's
Yeah.
okay. That's just part of the process. And I have been able to observe my process with so much more compassion and gentleness for just me needing to be where I am and like do this probably in some way for the rest of my life. And I think there's like a hopelessness to the like, I have to live with this forever, but also like if I can accept that, then I can harm do some harm reduction in my swings and just keep an eye on it more compassionately.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. As you're describing this, it's really making me think about this visual, this Kintsugi visual that Asher and I have been like kind of using to understand sort of what happens to us as people. And I think in a way, actually, especially people with CPTSD, sort of the sensation of the cracks were already there long before us, like intergenerationally, ancestrally. And then we have our own like breaks and wounds that take place. And I'm sort of, as you're talking, I was having this sort of like visual of like all of the little places that we feel our own fractures and the things we do to hold it together and the other things maybe we do to kind of stay in sort of relationship with the self that feels familiar, even if it's the self that feels, yeah, chaotic or messy or disconnected in other ways. And so one of the ways we've been using this metaphor is sort of thinking about like, yeah, like sort of looking at the breaks, understanding them, being with them. I think, yeah, as clinicians who are all also like survivors of trauma, I think it is like a really unique place to hold. And I'm very impressed that you're writing a book about that. There's like an aspiration for me in that, and also a lot of fear, right? Because of what you described, having to like kind of touch it all. So I guess the second question we ask is about, so the process of kintsugi is the broken ceramic or pottery is sort of repaired in two stages. And the sort of first of the two is a really critical stage, which is sort of like the lacquer, the thing that is strong and maybe ultimately invisible in some ways because it gets covered in gold, which we'll get to. But we think, it's so valuable for us to kind of give voice to those parts, because I think there's sometimes the parts that we don't see in one another every day. We might not know the kind of work someone is doing to heal, the kind of community care someone is reaching out for and getting. And so we wondered if you might speak a little bit to what some of the lacquer or kind of strong repair work has been like in your process.
Yeah. I think of this, both my relationship to self and then my relationship to like my most intimate attachment people who
Mm-hmm.
support me on a day-to-day basis. And in my relationship to self, it's just all the basics that we forget when we're spinning, right? Like sleep, hydration, nutrition, exercise. Those are the routines and rhythms that we really need to keep our body going and keep our body nourished and healthy. And I think when we fall too far in either direction, we forget to keep up with some of those basic rhythms and routines. And so when I'm spinning in either direction, like that's one of the first things I know I need to do to take care of myself. And I have a really supportive life partner who, you know, much to his chagrin, helps hold me together. And, I think that's part of it too, is like, I think there's a lot of times where he gets really frustrated, like, oh gosh, this again, right? Like, here we are. But he's also so good in like making sure that I'm getting fed, and he holds the family together when I'm, spinning. And he kind of protects like the children from my wild swings sometimes. And I'm so, so grateful to just that like invisible yet absolutely necessary daily care that needs to happen first before we can really get to the other layers.
Yeah, for sure. A thought I had is we all need that care, right? Like no one can do it alone. And yet I think it's not often we hear people give voice to the fact that sometimes we each just need one another.
Mhm.
And that's not like some of us, that's actually all of us need that. And it's beautiful to hear that you kind of have that in your partnership, like that kind of, it sounds like there's almost like a mutual agreement. Like even if we both don't like this in moments, we like agree to do it and like support one another in it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's a
yeah,
lot of accountability too, right? Like a lot of me being honest when I don't want to hear the hard truth of like, okay, you're right. I'm doing that thing. I'm doing that thing. And I need to check myself and like come back to earth a little bit and um, really acknowledge what's happening here. And then, for him, he doesn't want to be my guardrails like that. No one wants to do that for their life partner. And then every once in a while he has to. And, we both acknowledge that as a, element of our partnership.
Mhm. I just also want to say it's so refreshing to hear people say, I need someone to like cook for me sometimes, just like we all need that. And yet I think sometimes, unless we're in some kind of like emergency situation, we don't always kind of allow ourselves to incorporate that into just the basics of what we need to move through some of these periods of time of like dysregulation or whatever, especially as adults, especially as care workers, where we're like supposedly experts on holding space for others. And um yeah, it's just nice to hear you kind of be transparent about that like seemingly invisible care.
Yeah. And I think what's really fascinating about care workers is that we will hold it together for everyone else. Like, we'll still like knock it out of the park at our jobs. Like I never let any of those responsibilities fall. But then it's the things that are closer to myself and my core and my home that can fall apart more readily.
Ooh, yes,
yeah,
definitely.
familiar. I feel like Asher and I have been having a lot of conversations about that, maybe at the urging of each of our therapists too, of like, how are you getting the care that you give? Like, where is that happening for you? And I was thinking it's interesting to think of accountability as a physical thing because it's sort of ephemeral and yet it is really physical sometimes. The checking in, the making sure, the touching base,
Yeah.
which I think is like an important reminder for all of us that those things are really like necessary, like foundational things because you can't continue if you're that malnourished or that untended.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Definitely.
Um, and I guess, yeah, maybe the final question is about the gold or what is illuminated. We're interested to talk with folks around like in the experience that you have had and are having, like what is it that for you sort of stands out as being the piece you hope to illuminate and see and be with
Yeah.
and share in the case of this moment as well?
Mm. Two things really stand out for me with this. First is just the humanity of care workers and therapists. Like I think, we're pedestaled so often and people think that we have everything all together, we live perfect lives, and we execute everything that we tell our clients perfectly. And that's simply not the case. We have our own struggles and our own flaws, and we're, in it in kind of the same way. I mean, especially in this season of so much, world uncertainty and terror, and, we feel it all alongside everybody else. Um, and then I think the other part that really stands out to me is just really wanting to illuminate this pattern and normalize it. I think so many of us think like, oh, we're going to overcome this, right? We're going to like go to some therapy and then we're going to no longer have any shame. We're going to overcome this, or we're going to overcome, the trauma that we experienced. And like part of, this deeper CPTSD work is recognizing like this will be with us for the rest of our lives. And we have these, kind of core templates that are set that we can definitely observe and unlearn, relearn in some ways. But there are some foundational elements that will kind of be core to who we are. And that's okay. And we can work with it. We can really highlight and illuminate the beauty of, working with our brains and with our rhythms, and instead of fighting against it. Because sometimes, most my most creative generative phases is when I'm in one of these swirls. That's part of it.
Yeah. It's bringing me back to kind of what we were talking about when we first got on the Zoom, and we were talking about the election and how we're all feeling. And I think both ourselves and also our clients might have some idea about how we're handling all of this. And I guess, it's nice to hear that, for instance, something as heightened and intense as this United States election, right, is going to impact everyone. But it's also, if you are working with CPTSD, it is something that can activate you in all sorts of ways, and that isn't that's to be expected. And like you said, it can't be something, or it can be something we continually sort of work against, but that I guess what I hear you saying is there's something about accepting that we have to work with our brains and we have to work with our legacies of trauma. We don't always have to like love or permit all the ways that we are reactive around it, but that there is a kind of an extent to which, the fighting against it is really what causes so much suffering.
Yeah. We can't suppress it. We can't deny it. We can't exile our shadow parts. And, I think so much of where therapy is evolving as a field is into more of that integration and that like more transparent acknowledgement of it. I think so much of the traditional Eurocentric ways of healing is coping skills and boundaries and, kind of the superficial surface ways to like soothe, but not actually like deeply rooted, acknowledge, be with. And that in itself is what's healing, not necessarily changing it or making it go away.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was thinking it's like almost maybe rather than see it as something to be fixed, what I hear you saying is to see oneself instead of being, I am broken, as I am human. And that actually having that sort of like self acceptance sort of expands and allows for like a feeling of a form of healing that we don't always sort of see as being as valuable as it really is because of the kind of world we live in and white supremacy, capitalism.
Totally. And it's so vulnerable. It's so vulnerable to, even share this story here, right? Like in a public way of like, as a supposed expert, as a professional, as someone who, doles out a lot of advice publicly, to say like, hey, I still go through this. I mean, pretty much all the time. And, where you catch me and what I present myself publicly may or may not be reflective of what's going on behind the curtains.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you being willing to do that. And just based on, first of all, the experience that we have had with our collective members and working with care workers who are desperate to hear stories like this and to feel, kind of validated in the behind the curtain stories, that, because I think care workers are held to just like an enormously rigorous standard. And it is, yeah, it's an impossible standard. So I appreciate that. And also just for, other people are listening who idealize their therapists or, whatever, maybe we can work towards softening that idealization a little bit. I think that also is very helpful at times. So I hear you're writing a book, but is there anything else, or the book itself, that you want to kind of tell our listeners about, or ways that they can kind of connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on TikTok and Instagram as Dr. Han Ren. My website's drhanren.com. I have a group practice in Austin, Texas. That's pivotpsychologyatx.com. And the book that I'm writing is called The Hyphenated Life. And it's all about navigating the liminal spaces between multiply marginalized intersectional identities. Feeling too much for this space, not enough for another space. And in the process of writing this, really recognizing that that is kind of a universal feeling, whether you hold intersectional marginalized identities or not. And so I really hope that I can bring light to some of the ways that complex trauma and systems of oppression and shame and guilt and fear really intersect to shape our experiences, and the ways that our society really sanctions some trauma responses over others, and we kind of think we're cycle breaking by being perfect or people pleasing or overworking, and then recognizing, okay, maybe we need to like strip that down and find a different idea of liberation. So this book will be out in 2026 if all goes well, if I can finish it. But yes, it will be. I'm putting that into there. It will be out in 2026.
Wow, it sounds great and very important. And I wish you a lot of luck and ease as you're writing, because it does sound like it sounds like a really important work, and it also sounds like it's confronting. It's like confronting to do the writing and all of that. So, and we want to thank you for being on the podcast. We really appreciate it. It's really nice to just get a chance to talk to you and get to know you a little better.
Yeah, thank you for having me. What an honor.
Thank you so much.